gentlemen, welcome to another episode of the Universe Within podcast. This episode of the show is being sponsored by the Amazonian Plant Healing Center, the Temple of the Way of Light. I've actually personally worked at the temple for the last 10 years or so I can really attest and vouch for the quality of the work that they do. They predominantly work with the plant medicine Ayahuasca, working in the lineage of the Shipibo people, and they offer 12-day retreats, and in those 12 days there's 6 ceremonies. They work with 4 curanderos, or Shipibo doctors, healers, 2 to 3 facilitators, which is kind of like the bridge between the guests who come down and the Shipibo who they're working with. They're working with a pre-ceremony yoga teacher, vegetalistas or herbalists, bone doctors, massage people. There's a really good screening process for before people come, a lot of material, a lot of preparation, a really amazing integration team. So all in all, it's just a really amazing experience. So if anyone has interest in working with ayahuasca or these sacred plant medicines, the Temple of the Way of Light is a really amazing place to go and to be able to really deeply experience those. They've been closed, unfortunately, since the beginning of the pandemic in March of 2020, but they're scheduled to reopen in August of this year. So if you'd like more information about the temple and the work they do, you can check out their website at templeofthewayoflight.org, and there'll be a link also in the show notes. And myself and my friend and colleague, Marav Artsy, who I interviewed in episode 28, I believe, of this podcast, we are continuing to run dietas, diets, which is a traditional process that people really go into a process of isolation, of fasting, and ingesting some of these different medicinal plants in a journey of healing, of learning, and really being able to be taught by these plants. So that's a really amazing opportunity to go deeper into this work. We're just finishing a dieta, and we'll be running one in upstate New York in the month of July. We'll be back here in the Sacred Valley of Peru in September working, and I believe we're going to try and be in Egypt in the Sinai Desert in October. So if you'd like more information about the work that we do, about dieting with us, you can check out my website at nicotianarustica.org and Marav's site at tobaccodiets.com. My guest for today is my friend Scott Hussa. I met Scott working in the Peruvian Amazon jungle at the Plant Medicine Center, the Temple of the Way of Light. It's probably been, 7 or 8 years now that we met. And I've known Scott for a long time. He facilitates ceremonies there at the temple. And he has a really beautiful story. We talked about a lot of topics. He shared some of his story, and it was quite beautiful, quite intimate, and really just his journey that's led him down this path, what he's learned. We talked a lot about facilitation and plant medicine, and I think it was a really fascinating conversation, and I think and hope you guys will all really enjoy and get something out of it. So, as always, if you're able to help to support this podcast, that's a really big help to me to continue to bring on guests like Scott and to continue to make these podcasts. Patreon is a really good way. It's a subscription service, and for as little as $1 a month, you can subscribe. There's different tiers you can sign up for. And with that, you get added benefits, things like early access to shows, bonus material, Q&As. So that's a really big help for this podcast, a really big help for me. To everyone who has done that, thank you very much. To all the patrons, I really appreciate all the help and the support. And if you're able to do that, I would greatly appreciate it. There's also the option of direct donating via PayPal. I'll put a link to both of those in the show notes. And if you're not able to do that, simply subscribing to the show, going on the YouTube channel, subscribing, turning on the notification bell, liking the video. That's a really big help with the algorithms. And then with the audio version, going on Apple Podcasts, subscribing to the show, and if you can, leaving a starred rating and a short review. That's a really big help. So I think that's it. And without further ado, here is my conversation with Scott.
I'm running out from the maze, running out from the maze, running out of the maze today. Running out from the maze, running out from the maze, running out from the maze today. I'm running out from the maze, running out from the maze, run out of the maze today.
Well, cool, man. Well, it's good to have you.
Thank you very much for having me.
Yeah, man.
I hope I can contribute something worthwhile.
For sure.
But yeah.
So probably by now, if people don't know, a lot of the guests I've had on this podcast, I met working at the Amazonian Plant Healing Center, the Temple of the Way of Light. That's how we originally met. So maybe just to start a bit about your background. Also, just as a side note, there was a guest of ours who requested we spoke, so I think he'll be really happy to hear this. Peter, do you remember him? Peter Moffat, I think is his name.
Yeah. Definitely rings a bell. Yeah.
So yeah, maybe just a little bit about your background, like where you're from, your life's journey, what eventually led you down to the Amazon, into this very kind of peculiar field that you found yourself in.
Okay. So I was adopted when I was 3 years old from Seoul, South Korea, or actually just outside of Seoul in Incheon. And, grew up for about 3 to 4 years in Minnesota. And my parents divorced. My brother, who's not adopted, along with my mom and I, moved out to Oregon from Minnesota and pretty much grew up there on the coast, northern coast, in Seaside. And that was kind of early childhood. Was in university, and I think I was on that track of just kind of going through the motions. I had a pretty strong sense that, if I finished, I'd probably end up going right into a job. I wanted to travel a bit, so I ended up leaving University of Oregon at the end of my junior year and went to Asia just to kind of like get some traveling underneath my belt, and was in Tokyo for about 6 months, and that was an eye-opener, being really the first time traveling solo internationally. And I studied Japanese in university, but it was not nearly enough to the point where I felt like I could navigate Tokyo, as it were. I got around, but it was just a very foreign experience, and to kind of be in that environment. I had some Japanese friends that I'd met in university, and they were a big help, but a lot of it was just kind of I want to say part soul searching, part exploring the world. And after about 6 months, I was looking for work as well. I wanted to see if I could get some international work before I graduated as well. And nothing really panned out there. So I was getting ready to go back to the States. And I was on the phone with my mom. And she said, well, you're so close to Korea, it would be a shame if you just didn't visit the country that you were born in. So, I sat with that for a couple of days, and it's like, okay, I'll check it out. And it was a really interesting experience, because it was probably the first time in my life that I felt synchronicity in just very magical ways. So, as an example, I had met some Canadians when I was during a trip to Malaysia. While I was in Japan, I took a trip to Singapore and Malaysia. Met some Canadians there who were working in Seoul, and kind of got to talking, and they said if I ever got to Korea, that they had some Korean contacts that they could put me in touch with. So one thing led to another. I ended up meeting this contact through this Canadian woman that I had met in Malaysia at the airport. She picked me up, helped me get into a hotel, which turned into, unbeknownst to her, a love hotel, which was really funny because I wanted to spend a week there. And checking in, the guy just kind of looked at me like, what? I had all my luggage, so I'm sure he had some pretty interesting thoughts going through his head.
You're not paying by hour.
Yeah. And so, after checking in and kind of having a very interesting check-in experience in what was a love hotel, she took me to one of her watering holes, and it was this Western rock and roll bar. And I ended up meeting 3 Canadian English teachers. And, they were acquaintances of hers, and one of the guys was like, hey, I'm at the end of my contract. I'm leaving in the next month. Do you want my job? And I was taken aback. I was like, literally, I've just gotten off the airplane. Like, no, I don't want to teach English. Like, thank you. Very kind of you. And he's like, Seihi, who was my Korean contact, she has my number. So, if you change your mind, like, just have her get in touch with me. And so, I kind of put that on the back burner, really didn't think that much of it. And about a week later, he contacted her and asked if I'd just come in to check out the school. And so I was like, oh, okay, nothing else to do. And went in and met with the owner. Basically after a 15-minute interview, she asked if I could start the following week. At this point in time, I was having such a good time, just being in Korea. I was like, okay, I can do this for a year. And 1 year ended up turning into about 11 years. Wow. And in that time, did English, taught English for the first 3 to 4 years. I did a lot of privates after the first year. I kind of became an independent contractor. And picked up some really weird side gigs in that process. I was a part-time radio host for the English business section. I don't know how that happened, but it was with EBS, the Education Broadcast Service, which is like PBS in the U.S. And was doing that for about a year. That led into the first actual job that I had, which was working for an online education company, putting content together. And I was there for about a year and a half, and then that led into joining a startup, which was kind of a more business-focused. It was English lessons, but it was really focused on like Western management systems and how North Americans predominantly, engage in business. More of how the language is used, how to use the language within a business setting, that became a partner in that. And after about 5.5 years of working there, ended up leaving and got headhunted by one of actually the clients that we had at the time, which was Samsung Tesco, and was brought on to work at their head office to do one-on-one coaching with their executive leadership team, so directors and senior vice presidents, which was really fascinating because the way I was introduced into the role was Tesco had their own management blocks that they wanted the Korean managers and directors to really, take on. And so I'd have one-on-ones with VPs and directors, every week. And after the first month, the HR director came in, who was Korean. He was like, hey, Heard you're doing good. Is there anything that you need? And I, jokingly said to him, you can get me a couch because we're really not going over any of these, the training blocks that Tesco's International wants us to go over with the leadership. It's kind of more like a therapy session, which was really fascinating. And he was like, oh, okay. And kind of blew it off, which I was, that was interesting to see how much of a disconnect there was between what my understanding of the role was, being kind of brought in as a consultant, and the actuality of that. So that was kind of the first, I'd say, foray into what eventually led me into facilitating, specifically with plant medicine, but basically spending a lot of time just listening to these mid to senior level vice presidents and managers unloading emotionally about all of the stress that they were and challenges that they were facing, whether that was in family, work, in their relationships, their marriage. So it was really fascinating. And that in a nutshell was kind of my time in Korea. And I was getting to this point where I really wasn't enjoying the work. It was that that kind of cliche, love the paycheck, didn't love the job. And, that's pretty shallow at the end of the day. It's not super fulfilling. And, there was this other component of, after being in Korea at around, the 10 to 11 year mark, I just had this sense I need to make a decision. Either I'm going to permanently live here and, integrate completely into Korean culture and everything that entailed from a cultural aspect, which I had my own resistance to. There's, seniority, age is very important there. Face, how you present yourself, is very important. And I just had a lot of internal conflicts. And it was around this time that I believe it was on one of Rogan's early podcasts. He was talking about working with DMT, and he had a friend who had, drank ayahuasca. And it was at that time when I was like, okay, this is actually interesting. There were some aspects of just my own identity that, I'd been dancing around, I'd say probably since high school, but never really went deep into, around being adopted, being raised in a, predominantly, upper white middle class family, being the only person of color in the family, and just what is my place? And living in Korea definitely helped, but there were still some nagging questions that were there, that I was kind of getting to that point where I was ready to explore it, with purpose. So made the decision to go back to the States and kind of reset, and figure out what I wanted to do with the rest of my life. What do I want to be when I grow up, kind of thing. So it was after about 3 years of being back in the States and kind of, just reintegrating back into Western culture. It was a really beautiful experience after living overseas for, 11 years. I did this road trip with my stepfather from Oregon down to, my parents had basically moved back to Texas, or moved to Texas. And we did this road trip, and it was this really beautiful experience of rediscovering and reappreciating, the different parts of the U.S., going down the Pacific Coast Highway and just really having a newfound appreciation of the beauty that the West Coast has, driving down the coastal highway and then cutting across into, Nevada and New Mexico. And just seeing the diversity of the landscape and the beauty in nature. It's such a diverse country and landscape, that I don't think I traveled across the U.S., moving from Minnesota to Oregon, but as a child, you just don't really appreciate it. It's always about getting to the destination rather than appreciating the journey. And so this was, it was a really beautiful reconnection back into the U.S. And just the amazing diversity that the country has, and started to just think of okay, what is it I want to do? And after some thinking and just kind of, I'd say maybe calling in spirit, or being more open to what I should do next. Peru just kind of clicked, and did my research on, I think, 3 different centers, and temple, felt like it was the right place to go. And that kind of was the beginning of my whole journey with working with plant medicine, and went down for what was called the Deep Immersion Program. I believe they're still calling it that, but at the time it was 30 days, and now I think it's around 28 days or 26 days.
So it was 23, although I think it's no more because of the pandemic.
Right.
Yeah.
Went down, and it was really fascinating. I'd done my research around working with plant medicine, and had checked online as far as various people's experiences working with the medicine, and it's interesting in retrospect to kind of I think both you and I, when we're working with first time drinkers, it's always trying to manage and kind of temper the expectations. You hear so much about I'd say the extremes of the experiences, and there's actually quite a bit to be found in the details and in the nuances. And sometimes it's not the super profound, explosive type of ceremonies that you get the most out of that really last over a period of time. And so, trying to be very grounded in, what my first ceremony was going to be like. And it was really profound in the sense that it opened up into something that I wasn't fully expecting, and at the same time was very familiar. And I remember the thing that I remember the most from that first ceremony was I think just internally saying, wow, throughout, for most of the ceremony. And we had a total of 8 ceremonies, and I'd say the first real challenging ceremony I had came in my 4th ceremony. And I was at a point where, I was ready to kind of take the work deeper, as it were. And so my intention for that ceremony was, show me my life's purpose. And I had my own preconceived idea of what that should be based on, my past life experiences. So I was anticipating to get something that was very familiar. And what actually came through was something that really shook me to my core. I was yeah, I was just shaking. I was turning away from it, in ceremony, literally on my mat, just turning away from the center of the circle, and like, nope, you have the wrong guy. Like, this is not me. This is not what I want. And it was relentless. And so that there's many, I'd say, ayahuasca kind of cliche maxims that come through, and the one that the facilitators that I had during that retreat, one of the first things they said was like, be careful what you set your intentions for, because you may get something back that you're maybe not wanting, but it's not a negative thing, but it can be jarring. And so that definitely resonated with me. And it took, in some respects, I'm still working with it, coming to terms with what that calling or what that purpose is for me. And so, by the end of that retreat, I knew I wanted to continue working with medicine, that there was more as far as just my own personal process that I wanted to go into and to heal and gain insight on. And the temple had a work exchange at the time, and I wasn't ready to jump right into that, so I wanted to go back and integrate process that month, and that took about 6 months to do. And at the end of those 6 months, I came back to the temple, did the work exchange for 3 months, which was basically kitchen link or assisting in, I did a bit of permaculture as well. So it was really just, one, being able to be in that environment, being in that medicine space constantly, and just seeing all of my own programming kind of, surface over this 3-month period of time, longer. But yeah, again, seeing more of the nuances that come through in daily life, not just in the medicine space. And at the end of that 3 months, I think I'd probably annoyed and badgered the management to the point where they were open to taking a closer look at me, and so they asked me to extend for another 4 months. And at that point, that's where I felt like they were really kind of like checking me out to see, like, one, how do I interact with guests? How do I interact with the rest of the community? Am I a waste of space? Am I actually contributing something to the program? And had some really, really challenging ceremonies along the way, and I think that's also part of, at least in my own experience, working with this medicine, the deeper that you go, it's almost like relearning everything all over again. So, I remember I was interested in facilitating, and at the time, one of the requirements, as it were, was they wanted facilitators to have around 100 ceremonies, personal ceremonies. And the reason for that is, by 100 ceremonies, you've kind of done the bulk of your work. Not that it's over by any means, but, you've done a lot of the digging, and how, not just digging into that work, but how does a person actually choose to navigate when certain challenging things come up, things that are really jarring. And, I think I was at around probably 20 or 30 by the end of month, 4 or 5, and just thinking like, oh my gosh, like there's another 50 plus to go. And I think at the time as well, like pretty much all of the facilitator roles were, there was a pretty good stable of both male and female facilitators. So it was, I didn't really have my hopes pinned on that. And, so I tried to find other ways that I could contribute and, potentially stay on longer, and was able to kind of carve out a role for myself there. And at the end of the 4 months, had a meeting with the owner, Matthew, and Debbie, who still is the temple manager, director. And they asked me to come back full time. And yeah, I went back to the States to kind of just tie up loose ends. And I think I went back for about 1 to 2 months. And after that, like I was pretty much at the temple for the next 5 years, more or less straight. So yeah, that's kind of the long, short-winded version of journey into the medicine space.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, wonderful. What was that like, going from what seems like a very kind of, as you said, corporate world, face, presentation, to then being immersed in the Amazon jungle and working also with the Shipibo people who are very immersed themselves in that line of work? And was there something in that process that you also learned or changed from?
Well, I'm trying to think of how best to say this, because I don't know if I'd ever change anything as far as the events or things that brought me to where I am now. If anything else, I have a profound appreciation for my time and experience in that kind of corporate setting. I wouldn't choose to go back there, to that place. But it's a really good study in human nature. Especially with, you see an aspect or a slice of group dynamics, of power structures, how people choose to engage and interact with one another. In some respects, it reminded me of high school. There were cliques, and there's power struggles between different departments, different managers, and at times it seemed petty to me, and I feel like I could say that because I was outside of it. I wasn't necessarily, I wasn't required to engage with it to the same degree that the other employees had to. So that was a bit of a protective layer. Seeing, it was interesting, I know you've heard this as well, hearing the Shipibo healers kind of talk about the Western mind and the Western condition, and all of these things that they see when guests come down. It's a lot of this, fear. And I don't want to necessarily say it's manufactured, but in a way it is. A lot of the fear or anxiety that is created because of, the social structure of what we choose to place importance on. And so, without romanticizing, the indigenous cultures, in some ways, it's a lot simpler, but that doesn't necessarily exclude them from having, their own internal conflicts or problems or issues. It's just different. It has a different color and different texture to it. So, it was interesting. The more time that I was able to, just be around Shipibo, maestros and maestras, like I was able to pick up like, some of these things where there might be some conflicts or some, resentment or jealousy, and it's human nature. And one of the things that I appreciate about the teachers that I've had that are Shipibo is they don't deny, that they're on this heightened or, a spiritual superior level. Like they readily admit that they're humans. And at the end of the day, like, yes, they still have their own work to do around certain human characteristics or behaviors. But I think that there's more presence. There is an awareness and an openness to exploring that rather than, projecting it outward. And I think that's maybe the biggest difference that I, not to overgeneralize, but to kind of just put out there is, there's so much ego in modern society. I don't even want to say Western society, but in modern developed societies, this sense of, me and ego. And if something happens, how does that impact me? And how do I choose to interpret that, within my place of the larger scheme of, family, society, dynamics. So, there's a lot of, I see it as a lot of layers that we collectively have chosen to put on ourselves, distractions, as it were. And that creates a lot of layers to work through to actually get into, this seat of who we are at our core. Who am I? Am I this collection of societal beliefs, or family values, whatever those things may be? At the end of the day, do I choose to allow those things to define me as an individual? And, it's a really interesting process to go through. And what that process requires is actually time and space. And there's not that much importance given to opening up into that space of self-exploration in modern society and developed technological social structures. One of the beauties, one of the beautiful aspects that I felt that has come with this pandemic is in that initial stage, like it kind of forced people to have that time and space. And I'm sure it was very uncomfortable for a lot of people because it's maybe the first time where they've had to be with themselves and their thoughts. And, that can be really, really unpleasant, if someone isn't ready for it. So, yeah, I don't know if I answered your question.
Yeah. You mentioned this idea of like it takes a certain amount of ceremonies, and obviously that's to some degree different for different people, but there needs to be at least an ample amount where, as you said, one begins to dig up things, and then also, as you said, to begin to be able to work through those. Can you talk about that more? And it doesn't have to be just from your experience, but from your time being surrounded by many people who are going through those processes, like what that looks like. I mean, obviously it can be very personal to certain individuals, but maybe more on like an archetypical level, like what does that mean? I think to some degree, maybe people listening who've worked with plants may have some idea, but maybe also for people who haven't, like what is being dug up and what is being worked through?
Wow, that's it's a big question. I mean, I definitely want to be mindful of the guests that I've had the the honor of being witness to their process. So I think maybe the easiest way for me to answer that question is to just pull something from my own personal experience. Okay, so this adoption piece has been, it's very personal to me. And, my family has been very supportive in this, but, one of the things that came up for me that was really shocking in the sense of like, it was right there. How did I not see this before? Was seeing this pattern of that felt for me very much predicated on my early childhood and, not being able to trust. So, the pattern that I was actually able to first, when I saw it, that was, at a deeper level, for me, was seeing this really insidious game that I would play mentally. And it was on a very, very, very deep subconscious level. And it was testing people, whether that was family, whether that was friends, whether that was, girlfriends in the past. And it was how much can I push them away to the point where are they going to come back? Like, doing, either actions, that could be not telling the truth. It could be, cheating on a partner. Like, at what point can I push someone to make that decision of like, I'm done. Like, I can't deal with you anymore. Like, you're just too wacky. And the game, and it was a very self-harming game that I play with myself, was, and this really was more around friends or, girlfriends, personal relationships, where it would get to the point where I would do something, either breaking trust or confidence, that they would leave, or they'd break off that relationship. And the moment that it would happen, there was a part of me that was validated. It was like, yep, I knew it. I knew I couldn't count on this person. I knew I couldn't trust this person. And it's interesting because I had this really beautiful conversation with my mom. And I mean, growing up as a teenager, I was probably, I wasn't the best behaved kid, and I definitely knew how to press my mom's buttons. And we got into a lot of, as it were, battles, nothing physical, but just, a lot of shouting and yelling. And there was, I don't ever recall a moment where I maybe as hard as I would try on a subconscious level to push her away, she would always be there. And, as I started to work with the medicine and, have, a lot of these memories come back to me in ceremony of being able to witness my behavior or my pattern or, a certain interaction from a detached point of view, and actually seeing like, oh, okay, I see what I was doing there. I was trying to push this person away because I was testing them, right? And, it wasn't a fun experience to go through. to actually see that aspect of myself, that I was causing harm to another person because I wanted to test them to see if they would actually, continue to, maintain that relationship, or, would they abandon me, basically, because of this trauma that I had, from adoption. Would they abandon me? And if they wouldn't, then it was like, okay, well, then I need to push that line a little bit more, right? And, I think most sane people will get to a point in a relationship where it's like, this is not healthy for me. Like, I just need to exit. And, it was kind of this point of self-reflection of like, how many people have I harmed? How many people have I hurt? Because I wanted to prove to myself that I couldn't count on them. And that's a very, on the surface, just talking about it, I can make sense of it, on an intellectual level. And, I'm assuming that some of the listeners out there that are hearing this, they're like, oh, okay, they can understand that. But this is where the medicine component comes in for me, was to feel it, to actually feel my own guilt, my own shame, my own sadness, all of these emotions, in a very, very visceral way, around this programming, this defense mechanism that I had created for myself, to be safe, and to actually see that, and to experience it, what was challenging, like, and also, there are guests that have gone through their own process, and one of the thing that fascinates me with this work is that the inner child that's hurt, and it doesn't necessarily have to be a trauma that people will automatically go, oh my God, that's horrific that this person experienced or went through. It could be something that on the surface seems for some people insignificant, but for a child to experience that separation of self, where something has to come in to protect, is very, very personal and very profound. And to go back into those types of traumas, for lack of a better word, and to re-engage with that moment in time where the trauma happened, or to actually see yourself as that hurt child, and to actually show up for yourself in that moment and be like, you're okay, and I'm here for you now. There's I believe Gabor Mate talks about trauma is any trauma really comes down to this separation of your authentic self. And that's always the first time I heard that was at the temple, and I've held on to that in my own work, and then also working with guests to see and to feel what that can look like, and how that can have an impact on an individual. And it doesn't, even have to be in early childhood. It can be at a later stage in life. But that separation from your authentic self, of who you are at your core, when you strip away all of the layers and projections that family, friends, society, places onto an individual, you strip all of that away. What's left? Who are you at the end of the day? Who am I? Do I choose to, buy in and believe these things that I've been told about myself? Some of them positive, some of them negative, you know, but to actually explore that and to see where some of these maybe harmful or hurtful self-beliefs have been created in part because of something that's happened in the past. So yeah, that's kind of the deeper work, to see these patterns for me, and that I've seen guests go through and navigate in their own way. And everyone is so uniquely different and beautiful. How they get to that point is, it's that warrior's journey. You know, it's very, very personal, and no one individual will have the same exact path, should they choose to put in the work and the time to, you know, get to these places. So, yeah.
You mentioned that often what people hear about, and kind of this idea of setting aside expectation, or these extremes.
Yeah.
What do you mean by that? And can you give examples of like what those kind of common things are that people hear?
Yeah, I'd say, you know, if someone is doing their research about, you know, they've heard about working with plant medicine, specifically, you know, ayahuasca or uni, as the Shipibo call it. You know, you hear horror stories of, you know, for the most part, females being taken advantage of in the ceremony space by, you know, a very questionable curandero. You know, those are probably some of the more common horror stories that you hear. You know, the other ones, you know, tend to be that really around the container and how that space is being held and who's holding it. You know, do they have the experience? Do they have the training to work with guests in a very heightened emotional and spiritual state, where you know, you're very open to, you're impressionable, you know. So being told one story that, you know, really was for me, you know, horrific to hear about was, you know, this was at I don't actually know the center, but you know, one of the people that was working in the space, I don't know if they were actually facilitating, but they told a guest like that, you know, in a former life, you know, they're responsible for the mass murder of, you know, 10,000 people, you know, and it's like, okay, what's the point in, like, you know, passing that information on to someone, you know, and it wasn't requested, it wasn't asked, it was just kind of like, you did this, you know, and without really being aware of that person's mental state or emotional state and how that would land, and how that potentially the effect of, you know, being told something pretty horrific about, you know, yourself. Now, who knows if that's true or not, right? But to have someone else tell you, or for someone to tell another person that, you know, is, yeah, I don't view that as being ethical, you know, working with the medicine. It's really, a facilitator's job isn't really to, you know, tell or guide, you know, direct the person in the direction of how this process unfolds, but to be kind of an anchor in providing a sense of safety and stability. And, you know, the way that I was trained at the temple was, you know, it's not about me, the facilitator, right? It's really about that individual and what can I do to support them. And oftentimes that's just listening, you know, allowing that person to figure things out for themselves. So, you know, horror stories run the gambit from, you know, inappropriate physical contact with a guest to not providing a safe container to saying certain things to a guest that are, you know, harmful, detrimental to their process. providing questionable medicine. I mean, there's just, yeah, it is in some respects the Wild West, because we're working with a very potent plant medicine. And I've spoken to a handful of, therapists that work with the medicine, but are also part of, these larger organizations, whether that's IC or MAPS. And, one of their concerns is like, there's no standard, there's no actual framework. And this is where it gets to be, I don't know what the answer is actually, because in the way that I've been trained into the medicine, it's through the Shipibo tradition, and it has its own customs, it has its own way of working with the medicine. And to try and impose or bring in a Western mindset that puts in a structure, I don't know where that balance or that line is between respecting the tradition while also providing a level of structural safety that Western medical practitioners would be comfortable with, because that would override, I think, a lot of the traditional, the tradition in how they work with the medicine. It's, yeah. So I think that's in part where there's a lot of uncertainty when working with ayahuasca or any other very potent plant medicine. Is these are traditions that have been in place for, some would say thousands of years. To bring in a Western medical model to place on top of that, I think needs to be done very, very cautiously, and, first and foremost, being aware of the actual tradition and what that means. So going back to your question, I mean, yeah, the horror stories are oftentimes, it's a byproduct in some respects of, people maybe not doing their homework, jumping in. There is a bit of an eagerness in some circles to trip balls, as it were, in the jungle. And, I've met a few quote unquote psychonauts that, have come to the medicine. And again, to bring in, this point of view that I've heard pretty much all of my Shipibo teachers say is ayahuasca is not a drug, it's a medicine, and someone who's looking to see rainbows and unicorns, like, yeah, they may see that in a ceremony, but at the end of the day, like, what are you taking away from it? Like, this experience of drinking the medicine, sitting in a circle, that there's something deeper there that, if the person is willing to engage with it, can be quite beautiful, and transformative. But, it's hard to say, what is the right way and what's the wrong way, to work with this medicine. I have my own views. I've always worked within the Shipibo system and tradition. That's what resonates with me. And this is not to say that, other traditions, such as, Santa Daime out of Brazil, or, other traditions out of Ecuador, or Colombia, that those are wrong. They're just different ways of working. And I think it's really important that if anyone is wanting to sit with this medicine, specifically, that they do their research, like really understand like what are the differences between these different traditions, and what is their approach, and what is the purpose of partaking in this medicine within that system. So more often than not, I think the horror stories come with, an ignorance. And I don't mean that in a derogatory way. It's just a person doesn't really know what they're stepping into, quite possibly, and hasn't vetted for themselves the proper, ceremony space. I know that there's quite a few underground ceremonies running in North America, and I personally would, I would be very mindful of choosing to do so, even now with my experience.
So on the one end, these kind of, as you said, horror stories, and then the other end being like these kind of magically visionary experiences where people are just kind of looking to come down and replicate that.
Yeah, I mean, the ones that crack me up, or I find humor in, are the ones where people are, they feel like they're the second coming of Christ, or which maybe they are. Who am I to say that they're not? But more often than not, the ones that fall on the oh my, oh my goodness, like it was this mind-blowing experience. If you actually listen to what the people describe, and this is where I would personally make the distinction, like, are they talking more about the actual visuals that happen? Because the visual space can be quite intense and beautiful, and some people may see something like a replay of an old movie, of a beautiful experience, or a memory. And, those are great. One of the things that I encourage guests when I've facilitated, before they go back home, is to remind them, like, the experiences and the visions, if they had them, they're very personal and they're meant for you. And there's a difference between having that experience and what that felt like, and what maybe that person actually on a literal level saw, versus telling it to another person. Because the more that you actually start to share that, it moves from an experience in time to a story. And the story will always morph over time. It'll become more colorful, it'll become more fantastic, it'll become, and it no longer has that very personal connection. You start to lose that the more you retell the story. And just to remind them that, like, this is a gift to you, and it doesn't mean you can't share it with other people, but maybe be mindful of how frequently and who you choose to share that story with. And again, Shipibo, the healers that I've had the opportunity to speak to, I mean, they often will not talk about their vision space, with other people, because it's theirs, it's meant for them, and in certain moments they might share some aspect of it, but rarely do they go into full detail about the whole kaleidoscope, purple unicorn, rainbow experience, because it's meant for them, and it is a gift, and I think it can also, part of the reason why I'm very wary of focusing on that visual component is, it, even by me, in, for example, like retelling my own personal experience around something that happened in that space visually, that's what people are going to kind of focus on and latch on to. And it's a component of the actual ceremony. It's not the whole ceremony in and of itself, but it's a component. But being humans, the easiest thing to relate to and to share to other people are the things that, we can express to other people. So, whether they believe it or not is a different story, but, what's the effect of that? So, again, just a word of caution to guests, is like, hey, if you want to share about your ceremony, that's great, but, try and ground it into something that is tangible, because if you tend to stray and just stay in this fantastical, magical space to someone who has no, connection or awareness or even maybe an openness to that, quite potentially they could be thinking like, yeah, you're tripping balls, okay, yeah. So what? You saw purple rainbows and, or purple unicorns and rainbows. So rather than talking about that and focusing on those visual aspects, what did it bring up for you on an emotional level? Because between humans, everyone, for the most part, can understand what compassion, immense gratitude, love, feels like, and more often than not, those images that come through in ceremony that are fantastical, they're often, connected with an emotional state, of deep, love, super profound, or a connection to everything, to life, to the trees, to the plants, to, a person in their family or their whole family, or to society at large. They can feel that on a very deep level. So, yeah, those are kind of the extremes, but that I haven't checked YouTube recently, but earlier on, like, it seemed like the experiences that were talked about fell into those extreme spectrums of horrific horror stories of, just, poorly held spaces or curanderos that were very questionable in how they worked with, predominantly female guests, to inexperienced or not untrained facilitators, to that other spectrum of just super fantastic, amazing, visuals. And yeah, that's what I don't want to say sells, but that's what will get the attention, when people are talking about medicine. And again, kind of like, I'm assuming like your format, it takes time for these things to really be fully expressed, because they can't be, reduced down into a soundbite to really relay or convey what that experience is like.
Yeah, great. So on that one end of the spectrum, like the horror stories, it seems like a lot of that can be, as you said, vetted through the opposite of ignorance, which I guess to some degree is like knowledge, like educating oneself, like finding a place that's well held, and then the other end, I think you used the word emotion. That oftentimes, like these very fantastical or visual experiences, there's something underneath that. There's an emotion, or there's a felt sense that experience is trying to point towards, and I often see that in. We had mentioned this idea of like expectation, and if you ask people often like, why are you doing this work? Mm-hmm. There's often, it's very interesting, the answer is often like a negative, in the sense of like, well, I want to get rid of my trauma, right. Or I don't want to have this weight anymore, or I need to find my life's purpose, which is also a negative, because it's not pointing towards the thing that I'm actually looking for in a way. And it's really interesting because I think it's often difficult for people to really express that emotion or the felt sense of what it is they're actually looking for. So would you say often those visual, those really kind of fantastic things, they're pointing to something deeper, whether that's a sense of awe or a sense of mystery or a sense of just like, wow, like the world is way bigger than I could have imagined?
Great question. I don't know. Could be. I wouldn't be surprised, if that's, if not a component, like why, those visuals come in as they do. It's the beauty of this work is I feel like the people I respect that are within the medicine space, whether those are curanderos or facilitators or people who are apprenticing, they come in with the beginner's mind, like irregardless of how many ceremonies they've had, could be 100, could be 200, could be 500. There's still this curiosity of seeking, of wanting to understand, of wanting to explore. So yeah, I would say yes to that question. Yeah.
So then, if those are the extremes, the bulk of the work, how would you describe that? It's this process of digging up, of self-exploration, of self-inquiry, of shifting and cleaning and clearing and aligning. Again, it's so personal, but if those are the two extremes, and those, in a sense, they can happen.
Yeah.
But there's this whole other end in the middle where kind of it seems like you're alluding to is the bulk of the work. That's where it's happening.
Yeah. I mean, I would say since I've worked with the medicine, my ceremonies are very different from when I first started. They're different in that they don't seem to carry the same like oh wow impact, and I think a lot of that, or I feel that a lot of that is because coming into the medicine and as I started to work with it, it was very unfamiliar, and as much as I was learning to work with the medicine, the medicine was learning to work with me. And so it's matured. Is maybe the best way to put it. My ceremonies have matured, and there's going to be, I'd say, a general level of cleaning, and clearing that needs to get done. And that could take, it's a very different number of ceremonies. I mean, it's hard to put a quantifiable number on that, for any individual. And it's not just the ceremonies in and of themselves, it's the work that a person chooses to do outside of that space, because the ceremony is that doorway that allows you to kind of step into this space that Irene, I don't know if you've had her on yet, but one of my favorite things that she would kind of share with guests is like, ceremony is that liminal space. It is the space between, where we are conscious and, from a day-to-day wake state into this kind of dream space. It's this very special, unique place to step into, but you're only allowed to really step into it for a moment in time. You're not meant to live there. So the insights and the awareness that, we hopefully gain about ourselves in that space, the real work is to take that outside of that space and apply it to our daily life, So when, anger. I worked on a lot when I first started, and it was taking those lessons about how I choose to engage with anger, my own anger, the things that triggered me, all of the narratives that I would collect that would reinforce my sense of injustice or being wronged, or that would feed into this anger piece, and recognizing that, being able to actually be okay with that emotion and give it space, but not deny it, but also not get swept up into that kind of the energy of it, and almost reveling in being angry and like, yeah, this is mine, and feeling, it's a very powerful emotion, but to actually find within myself, like, okay, this is trying to tell me something, right? It has a message for me. The emotion has a message for me. It has a lesson for me to learn from if I choose to pay attention to it. So, that's kind of where I would say that ceremony space, that bulk in the middle between these, what are often the most commonly shared experiences on the extremes, the bulk of it is really in that space of like, okay, like I am able to take this away from this ceremony. It was, this theme came up for me, or, this aspect of myself came up that I need to look at. And sometimes it's a reaffirmation of some very, very beautiful things about ourselves. And other times it's things that are not so pleasant, but, at the end of the day, it's equilibrium. We are light and dark, we are light and shadow. And so being fully accepting, and then taking those lessons from the ceremonies and applying them to our daily life, to my daily life, that's the work. And it's challenging. Some lessons are very easy, or integrate, very quickly. And I kind of view integration as when I don't need to think about, behaving or acting in a different way, where I'm not reactionary, but I'm responsive, where I don't have to actually mentally think about it and it just is, then I've integrated something, right? A new way of being. And, there are definitely lessons that I'm still working on, to fully integrate. Others have been integrated a lot easier than I thought they would be, So that's kind of that bulk. And I would say, I still have ceremonies that are challenging, but they don't come with the same frequency as they did earlier on. So a lot of what I feel my current ceremonies, when I do sit for myself, it's fine tuning. It's like, this analogy of, when you're driving, on a straight road, if you keep your hand at 12 o'clock, like at some point you're gradually going to veer off the road, right? And either go into opposing traffic or oncoming traffic, or, go off the edge. So it's like your hand, you have to constantly kind of fine tune, right? So you're driving in a straight line, and that's where I feel, the work, the maturity comes in with the ceremonies is, it's that fine course correction. It's like, okay, let's revisit this part. Like you're still, I'm still being challenged or being triggered by this aspect of my own projection outward, or, and oftentimes that's a self-reflection internally, things aren't the way that I want them to be, or I wish them to be different, and then redirecting that, well, what's that say about myself, So that's kind of where the work is. It's not as exciting in the sense of being able to tell other people like, oh my God, like, you know, I had this mind-blowing experience the other night, and I got this amazing insight about myself. It's more, yeah, nuanced and kind of there. So
Do you think part of that, like you said, is just like modes of format? Like obviously on YouTube, it's easier to speak about something for 15 seconds in a soundbite, or those kind of experiences. They carry more weight in a way if we say like, oh, you know, I went to the fifth dimension and I talked to the elves, and it's like, holy shit, wow, that. Or the opposite, like I had this terrible ceremony and I was abused, and I mean that's also very impactful in a way. But even, you know, like we've spent a long time talking about this, and even then it's a bit hard to grasp in a way, because there's something very ephemeral or intangible, and it's, as you said, it's very personal, and that's just harder to express in a way. Right. It's something, as you said, it takes time and space, and it's not so sexy in a way. It's like, yeah, I went into my anger. Okay. Yeah, but personally, that has a huge resonance. Like, as you said, if we just say that, it doesn't have the same resonance as because always that ceremonial space, as Irene was saying, in that like limbic space, there's something very profound there, and yet it's very difficult to put it in words too, and yet it's very impactful for the person.
But I you know, this is what I love about this work is it's an experiential process, like irregardless of how. I mean, we could talk about this for years, I'm sure, you know. And you could talk about it for years with various people, but there's no way for someone who is curious but hasn't experienced the medicine to fully understand it until they go through that experience. And that, you know, and that's the beauty of it. Like, you have to experience it for yourself. And I'm not by any means trying to, you know, persuade or say, you know, people have to do this, but you won't know until you go through that process for yourself, and that's the beautiful part of it. And a part of the human experience. Like, you know, I've never been in combat, you know. There's an interest in it for me on a personal level, because it, you know, it's kind of pushing that human experience to the extreme. You know, one of the things that I find fascinating about veterans, and I've worked with a few, you know, veterans that have come through to work with the medicine, is, you know, what other experience can humans have that brings you right up to that fabric of life and death, you know, like, and willingly, you know. Most people it's an accidental type of thing, or, you know, it's through certain situations or circumstances, but like in combat, like, you are, you know, a person is going into a conflict knowing that they may not come back, and then so that thread, that barrier between this reality and what's on the other side of it is very, very thin. And if you're faced with that on a continuous basis, I mean, that's got to have a massive impact on the psyche, on the, you know, on your emotional level, on spirit. And, you know, I have immense gratitude and admiration for people who have served and are serving to take that step, because, you know, I looked at joining the military when I was younger, and I mean, it just came back to me, like, as much as there was this call to want to kind of put myself into that type of environment or that situation, there was also something that was holding me back. You know, it's like, you know, once you have that experience, like, it imprints on you in such a way that, you know, you don't know what that outcome's going to be like. You know, you're going to be changed, that's for sure. And I think it's kind of the same working with medicine, is like, you can hear about it, you can read about it, you can watch videos about it, you can talk to people who have gone through that experience, but until you actually take that step, you don't know. And, you know, without freaking anybody out, I mean, the way that we work with medicine, you know, there is a life and death component to it. You know, if not the actual drinking of the medicine, but, you know, on a spiritual level, you know, on a psychological level, there are people that, you know, potentially can, you know, face death. There are people who have died, and again, that goes into the horror stories. You know, usually there's pre-existing conditions, but this isn't something to be taken lightly. And so, you know, I do view people who choose to come and work with medicine like they are embarking. You know, maybe they're taking the first step in that heroic journey of themselves, because they are going to be different by the time they come through the other side.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's something that really drew me to martial arts, and it's certainly not the same as combat, because the difference is in combat, there's no referee, there's no one to, there's no tapping out, there's no saying enough. But at the same time, it kind of, it recreates that in as safe a way as possible, kind of going to those extremes, like literally having someone choke you out, strangle you, cut your breathing off, like beat you up. You mentioned Joe Rogan. I think he often describes like mixed martial arts as like this like extreme problem solving, but with deadly consequences. Because also you can die. I mean, and people have. It's not very common because it's trying its best it can to create an environment where that doesn't happen, but there's that possibility. And that's interesting. You described like this idea that there was something about combat that drew you to that. And that seems like a very common theme. I mean, even ayahuasca is called Vine of the Dead. And I think that's often something people don't really, they just kind of brush it off. Like, well, that's a silly name. It's, you know, it's rainbows and unicorns. But, you know, ultimately, as you said, depending on how deep we want to go, there's potentially this facing death. Whether that's in a literal sense or in that limbic state of actually facing one's mortality and being willing to face that, to surrender to that, to come to terms with that. Do you think that's something that whether people realize or not is kind of inherently drawing them to that? Is that because, you know, also in much of our society, I mean, certainly there's a lot of things that are wrong. But at the same time, we've never lived in such a peaceful time. I mean, if you think of most of human history, especially if you were a young man, like the chances were you were engaged in some form of combat and your life was on the line. I mean, you know, human life expectancy wasn't that long. And a lot of that was other things, health and food, but a lot of that was you may die in combat. And that was just really a part of people's lives. And for most of us now, we don't have that. And I think to some degree, that's like where that reverence or respect for people who do enter that. Because whether one wants to or not, like that changes one's reality. Like you're put in that circumstance that most people in their lives, like they never face that intensity of those stakes.
it's interesting when, and I'd say it happens more frequently than I'd anticipated when I actually started to facilitate. But it wasn't uncommon to have a guest go through this sense of dying in ceremony, and on an intellectual and logical level, like they knew they were fine, but because everything gets ramped up, ayahuasca is amplifies everything, and so even though they were aware on a logical level, like no, they're not actually dying, this overwhelming sense, this feeling that they were dying, would come up. And it wasn't every single guest, but it was a significant portion out of the groups that I've worked with where this would happen. And in processing them, just kind of letting them share and express and talk through, because it's extremely jarring and scary to go through that process. And what was really fascinating to hear them as they would start to unravel that experience was more to the fact that a part of them, something that they had, that was a cornerstone to their identity or was a way of how they self-identified as who they were, that was being killed off, or that was dying, which was really interesting because it took them in a very visceral way, but metaphorically, to that point of facing mortality. And what did that mean for them? How did they choose to work through that? But yeah, there's death is really interesting, and
I think that's going to be the quote for the podcast.
it is. It's the unknown, right? We don't know, and so yeah, what happens, after we pass on? There's a lot of speculation. There's a lot of theories around, that our spirit, goes back into a collective, or our spirit, just moves on, maybe comes back into another body. But we don't know. And it is one of those beautiful mysteries that I think is, it's fascinating to sit with. But going back to your point around, we live in probably the safest times in human history. It makes you really curious around what is this mental condition that, modern society, humans in modern society have. It's like we manufacture our own ways to scare ourselves, to create conflict, right? And it's because everything is safe now. I don't have to worry about getting food or hunting for food. I don't have to worry about shelter. I don't have to worry about some animal in the middle of the night, coming into my camp and basically killing everybody. It's very safe. It's in some ways sterile. And so what is the byproduct of that sterility is we need to create, our own enemies, our own shadows, our own fears. It's a really, again, going back to kind of my own psychological test of pushing people away. It's like, as a collective society, we're talking about thousands of years of human evolution, and our the oldest part of our brain, this reptilian part of our brain, is so deeply encoded that when we don't have anything to actually fear, we'll actually create something. You know, and that's conflict or that's fear, you know. I mean, the amount of horror movies that are out there, like, why do we have horror movies? Because it's that adrenaline rush. It, you know, brings us back into that state, you know, of fear for our lives, you know. What's around that corner, you know? Is Jason, the other Jason, you know, gonna wake up from the dead and, you know, come after the rest of the camp? So, yeah, that's a really interesting point that you bring up. It's because we live in such safe times, you know, given the history of, you know, humanity, you know, death no longer is in our face constantly. So how do we respond to that? How do we react to that?
Do you think there's like a symbiotic relationship that's going on? Because it does seem this work is really spreading at a incredible pace. I mean, I remember 10, 12 years ago, I had a good buddy who was part of Santo Daime, so I had heard of ayahuasca, but if I mentioned that word to anyone, they had absolutely no idea what I was talking about. And now it feels much more mainstream. Because so much of this work, it does seem to work on the mind. I mean, even with Shipibo, one of the words they often use is like shina. Mm-hmm. It's like it's bringing balance, it's cleaning, it's clearing the mind, it's bringing alignment. Yeah. And I'm just kind of thinking out loud, but in the sense of like when we do begin, as you said, like to not be faced with death at potentially every turn. You know, walking in the jungle and a jaguar could come out. Like I have to be. There's a heightened sense of awareness that as those things we're not necessarily faced with that these medicines, much as you said, they heighten everything, and they bring all of these things up, and you know it's interesting because I think I've said this before in the podcast, but even these expressions that I used to take for granted, like having a roof over your head. Almost everybody has a roof over their head now. You know, there's very few people who don't. I mean, I remember there was even times where, like I was traveling and I had no money. I was backpacking. I was quite young, and like I literally had no place to sleep. But I still slept under a bridge because there was like a man-made structure that was giving me shelter. And yet in the jungle, there's, you know, thatched roofs. Yeah. And when there's a hole in that and it rains, which it rains a lot, like I really appreciated what it means to have a roof over my head. But very few people really think about that. Yeah. We're just not faced with that. Or, you know, even little things like water, like you have to carry all of your potable water and like carry that on your chest. And it's like, that's an effort, you know, but most of us, we turn on a tap and you know, especially probably for the majority of the audience, like they turn on their tap and clean water comes out, which is a miracle. Like there's all these lights here, and all I had to do was push this switch and they just came on. You know, I didn't have to go look for fat, kill an animal and get its fat and mold a little candle and, you know, light that. And that was my light for, you know, 15 minutes or an hour. And so do you think I know that's kind of a long question, but do you think there's this symbiotic relationship? Because you also use this really interesting thing, which is not like to idealize or romanticize certain things. And I think we can fall in that trap too. And one of the interesting things, which I think you were pointing towards too, is that, you know, even 2,000 years ago, the Buddha was talking about this idea that suffering was inherent in life. And that was a very different lifestyle people were living, and yet he was still teaching these universal principles. So even at that time, people were suffering. They were identified with beliefs and thoughts and patterns. But it does seem like it's this interesting moment where this work is really spreading. And so, do you see any correlation between like why that's happening at this time? Is there something that's lacking or that people are really needing and they're now reaching out to these?
God, I wish I had an answer for that. I have my own belief.
I think
You know,
that's all.
yeah, yeah.
That's all we got.
So it's interesting. Like, I was in ceremony when the pandemic first really started to come in. Like, it had just landed in New York, and in my ceremony, I saw this. I mean, it was just represented as this really massive, like like in a desert, when you see like desert sandstorms coming in, like it's just massive and it's thick. That's how the virus was kind of relayed to me, and it was like, oh, okay, that's interesting. But what was more immediate for me was like what was riding behind it, and it was just this tidal wave of fear and uncertainty. And I was like, that's massive. Like, just actually, kind of not just seeing it, but also like feeling like, like this massive cloud. And I'm, this very small, like, pinprick of a person, looking up at this massive thing, that's just moving. It has its own momentum, its own energy. And, it was like, okay, wow. Like, okay, in the face of that, like, all of this other surface stuff, like, kind of falls to the wayside. So what am I, what's humanity kind of left with? And the hope that came from that experience, that ceremony experience, was like compassion and love. Like, this is a time, like, collectively as a species, to really step into that, love and compassion for each other. And at the same time, as it started to, become more prevalent, rather than just something like, okay, it's, coming out of, China, and it's now in the UK, and it's now on the East Coast, and, as it started to actually move across, and then all of the lockdown and restrictions came in, it felt to me like a ceremony, like a dieta, like a plant dieta. It's like something's going on here, where whether it's nature, whether it's just something needs to find balance, and this is an opportunity. That's all it is an opportunity, with consequences, for people to reset. So, yeah, self-quarantining, that I know that was challenging for a lot of people. It wasn't fun. I didn't necessarily enjoy it, but it felt like a plant dieta for me. It was like, wow, okay, I'm not by choice, but like, because of circumstance, I kind of have to sit here and be with myself and maybe start looking at things that I've been pushing off to the side or suppressing because I'm too busy. I have other things to do, day-to-day life, type of things that are on the surface seem more important. And it was really interesting. It was like this global moment in time for people to take that opportunity, whether that was to connect back to themselves, to their family, to what actually was important. And, I think it's still ongoing. We're not going to know what the result is for probably several years, but, I feel like with ayahuasca coming in, I wasn't surprised. The center that I was at, Soltara in Costa Rica, it was, we shut down pretty quickly, but we were booked for the rest of 2020, and that was at the beginning of the year, and so it was just like the demand was there. Like people were already wanting to come and work with the medicine, and I don't know what it is. If there's just this underlying current of people kind of finding or sensing something needs to change, whether that's within themselves or, well, obviously within themselves, but on the greater scale, society at large. And so, I love how the Shipibo talk about why they started to serve Westerners or, guests, patients in ceremony, because traditionally it was just the curandero that would drink the medicine, and the patients would come in and get the work done on them without drinking. And, the story that I've heard from several healers is that the plants felt that they need to spread out. And, I wonder on some level if, that's part of the cause or part of the reason why there's this call for people to come and work with the medicine, is like the plants are actually trying to reach out. They're trying to communicate in whatever way that they can. And so, that could be a component as to why there's more people coming to work with the medicine. It was interesting during the pandemic, even now, but I noticed it within the first 6 months, like the number of former guests that were reaching out to me, and like, as soon as the travel bans lift, like, I'm ready to come and work with the medicine again. Like, I really feel like I need to work with it. And so, yeah, anecdotally, it seemed like there was some type of correlation or connection there, as far as what was happening globally, how that was affecting people, and those that had worked with the medicine, like, felt this instant call or desire to come in, work with the medicine again. Going back to what you're talking about, like, having just shelter, a roof over your head, some of the best experiences I've had in my life were in the jungle, where it was like, it was stripped down, like being in a tambo, this jungle hut where we had compost toilets, and, potted water had to be, carried in, not having light, or lights, we had candles, and it was rough in some respects, but at the same time, it was really comforting. Less can be more. And so, I found when I was, in the jungle, I fell into a natural circadian rhythm. I'd have a candle on maybe for a couple hours after the sunset, but I was usually in bed by 8:30, 9 o'clock, and I'd wake up around sunrise. Like it just, there was a natural rhythm, that was very easy to revert back into. And yeah, the challenging moments of, like, when there was a massive rainstorm that came down and the wind's blowing sideways through the mesh screen into your tambo. Yeah, they're not pleasant, and, in the moment you're kind of like, this sucks. But, like, it wasn't the end of the world, and, it felt, like I really enjoyed the jungle. I enjoyed my time there. I miss it in some respects, and reintegrating back. When I left the temple, I ended up going to Costa Rica to help run a ayahuasca center there, and very different environment. It was the jungle is just special in a way. And, coming from that environment to basically more of a resort type of setting, it was like refamiliarizing myself with like flushing toilets, with, electricity. And it was nice. I definitely wasn't going to turn it down as far as like having those amenities, but at the same time, it's kind of like, like it's too easy now, And so, to go back to your question around like, why are people feeling this call to medicine? And it's like, I tend to get the sense that, like, people, despite all of these modern conveniences and comforts that we have, the safety that they provide, the ease that life can happen because of these conveniences, something on a deeper level, like whether that's a loss to nature, that loss to connection, to our food chain, I wonder if that's part of the reason, like, people are wanting to seek out, this medicine, not just for that broader sense of getting back into nature and to connect to nature, but to themselves. What do I actually really need? Do I need the 2-car garage? Do I need the McMansion? Do I need all of these things that are constantly thrown at me that would validate me on a certain level within society's structure and tell me that I'm a good person and that I'm on track and that, I'm worthy. And if I step out of that for a moment in time, like, does it still hold true? Or do I see them for what they are? And it's not to, again, cast or demonize, people who choose to live that lifestyle. I totally get it. My family are very much, living that life, and, I would say they're happy by and large. I think at the end of the day, like, what is the purpose of life? What does that mean? What's the significance of that for an individual? And, for some, I think traditionally, it was like, you grow up, you have children, they get married, they have children. If you're fortunate enough to live that long, you're able to see your grandchildren. If you're really fortunate, you're able to see your great-grandchildren. And that's it, And again, there's nothing wrong with that. It's a perpetuation of, the human existence, human experience. But yeah, it's a great question to ask. Like, what, at the end of the day, what has my life really meant to me? What have I spent the time that I've had, the limited time that I've had on this earth? How have I spent it? What have I done? It doesn't have to be anything grandiose either. It's just like, I think some of I was listening to this one podcast, and it was with this former Green Beret, and he was talking about when he was in South America and he saw these kids, in a shanty, and it was part of his jungle warfare training, and like, they had nothing, and the smiles and the joy that these children had, like, for him, something resonated with him in seeing that, like, they are destitute by Western standards, right? And yet there's this joy, this happiness that's there, and that stuck with him. And, just hearing him say that, it reminded me of, what I would see in the community, in the village that was next to the temple, Tres Unidos. And yeah, there was, not that they didn't desire or want, I'd say a lot of the Western trappings, but they also found happiness in what they had. You know, it wasn't like, I don't know, it just seemed different. And again, I'm trying not, I want to be very grounded and not romanticizing that, but there was something mentally, there was a difference in what importance there was in that community. It seemed, you know, family, you know, seemed to be very high versus, you know, a new car, or whatever material thing there was. But yeah.
Yeah, one of the fascinating things I always noticed when I would go back to the States or Europe is watching kids, and so often, whether it was in restaurants or outside, kids would be having like a temper tantrum or crying or like yelling, and it's very rare that I ever saw that in the jungle. Like kids didn't really cry, and you know, it was fascinating. Like even, I'm sure there's a lot of factors, but like a kid running and they would fall. And I noticed a lot more, like in the US, the kid would start crying, but it wasn't coming from pain. Because there was a moment he would look to the parent, and it depended on how the parent reacted, what they did, based on what the child would do. And often in the Amazon, the kid would fall, and he'd look to the parent, and they'd just like grab him and put him up in the thing, or, you know, like, what are you doing? Da, da, da. Yeah. And the kid would be like, oh, there's no reward for crying, so I'm not going to cry. And then they just start laughing again. And it was as if it never happened. Yeah. And it was also interesting when you were talking about kind of living in the jungle, and that resonated a lot too, because, you know, as you said, it was like the only light was a candle light. And I remember many times where I forgot to get a new pack of candle, and I was at my last candle, and it went out, and it's like, well, I guess it's bedtime. Yeah. And you know, even in Iquitos, I remember often people would sometimes like ask me like, hey, can I bring you down anything from the States? And I'd always like, that was like salivating. I was like, oh yeah, like this and this and this and this. But at a certain point, it would run out, and then there was no way of getting it again. And I saw it in a way, it wasn't serving me. It was because then I was always looking for this other thing. And in Iquitos, it's this very isolated city. I mean, it's only accessible by air, which there's not a lot, and by boat, which are fairly infrequent too. So there's not a lot of things coming in. And so, you know, like sometimes I'd have like a shopping list, and it would be fascinating because if I found the thing, it was this very joyous experience. It was like, wow. Like, and it was never, because in a lot of the cultures we come from, if you want something, it's not only can you find it, there's 60 different varieties, you know, which one do I want? And overabundance. And there it was, if I found the thing, it was amazing. It was never good quality, you know, but it was like, wow, like it's a gift, you know. And like when I first came down there was no internet. So, you know, I'd enjoyed listening to podcasts or YouTube videos. There was none of that. And eventually, like, it never even crossed my mind, but I noticed a lot of the local people had radios. And I was like, huh. And so I went to the market and I bought this radio, and I was also fascinated by it because I hadn't seen a radio in ages. But there was something very, like, beautiful about it. It was, like, very nostalgic. It was all, you know, hand adjusted. It wasn't digital. It was all dials and buttons. And I took it back, and there was something that brought me a lot of joy. It was just listening to that radio. You know, and again, there was like 3 channels. But I found a great peace and a great joy just like laying in my hammock and listening to the radio. Even in the beginning, I could barely understand what they were saying, you know. It's, but that simplicity, there's something really beautiful about that, and that tension, you know, I think is really important, like that struggle, and maybe like what you were saying, like that's, if life becomes too easy, and I know that's hard for a lot of people to hear because they look at their own life and they're like, well, it's not easy, right? But again, things are relative too. It's like, well, yeah, maybe it's not easy because also I have all of these expectations. Like I want this and this and this and this and this and
Yeah.
this. And if I don't have that, it seems like my life isn't easy. But how many people truly are content
Yeah.
having a bed? Like how many people are really grateful to have a roof? How many people are really grateful to have clean water?
Yeah.
And is that enough? What was that like, that transition when you came down and you were doing, as you said, a lot of this digging, these ceremonies, and then eventually stepping into this role of working with other people, of facilitating, and kind of shifting it more from that internal journey towards it's maybe kind of an overused term, but like holding space or guiding other people.
I mean, the transition was pretty smooth for the most part. I was trained on door, which is I know you've had Felix on. So Felix was actually assisting in ceremonies when I started into that space. And so, yeah, I'd say the first year it was me just kind of observing the various facilitators, in the space during ceremonies, like how they would interact with guests, and as well as outside of the space. And every facilitator is unique and different, and so it was a really beautiful training period. Like I just tried to be a sponge and absorb as much as I could, like see how different facilitators would handle situations or interactions with guests, and then from the medicine side of things, like understanding how the medicine changes. When I was drinking for myself and going into my own process versus, taking a working dose and feeling the space and what was happening in that space, which that was like another layer of, oh wow, like, okay, this is actually happening. And I had no clue when I was, a pasajero, sitting in the circle, to actually be on the outside of the circle, but watching and being tuned in, and feeling the energies, which again, it's really hard to explain what that's like, but to feel the room collectively. And then so that was my first year, was just kind of learning, observing facilitators interact with guests. And then for me, with the medicine, understanding what it was like to work with the medicine, not to go into my process, but to be in that space, being completely open. To be completely open, and to feel what was happening in that environment. And so that was about a year of training, and then after that, some of the facilitators that had been there for a while, were ready to move on, and so a slot came open, and I was asked if I wanted to facilitate it. I was like, yeah, I've kind of been waiting for this, and I think with anything new, there's always that concern of not screwing things up too badly, and not, there was it's that learning curve of finding my own style, of what felt right for me. I observed a lot of facilitators, and was able to pick up on quite a few ways to engage with guests that I felt were that felt right, but then not necessarily stepping into it so that it was me doing it. It wasn't me like recreating, right, or mimicking someone else. So honestly, a lot of it was me just like being silent and sitting there, and this goes back to when I was working in Korea. Like a lot of the times when I was in Korea, it was like I didn't know what to say to some of the things that were shared with me. And it's just like, okay, wow, that's a lot. And so I think by default or through that experience, by the time I started to work with guests as a facilitator, I just I had that aspect of just, there's no need for me to probe. Like that's not my job to dig into somebody. Like they'll share what they want, what they feel comfortable and are ready to share. And it was, I think more of the questions that I had for other facilitators were actually around specific instances in the ceremony space when, someone was really struggling, or like how much should I engage with them? Like how much should I talk to them? And, I got some really good feedback from, the facilitators that I'd observed, but a lot of it was, again, like having to go through it for myself and kind of figuring out like, yeah, okay, like I probably indulged that person a bit too much, because they wanted an audience. They wanted, and part of that goes back into, on some level them wanting to just be seen and heard. But there's a line in like allowing that space, but then when does it become an indulgence and maybe not helpful because that's how they've always gotten attention. So again, kind of like this delicate dance of engaging and then knowing when to step back and allow that person to figure things out for themselves. And then, yeah, I always, this was really big for me when I first started, was like just asking permission, like asking permission to engage with that person. And this happened more in a processing setting outside of the ceremony. So like day after ceremony, if someone was really challenged and you could kind of see it, facially, or their body language was, they looked just, devastated or something, like coming up to them like, hey, are you okay if, I sit with you, right? Or can I ask how you're doing? That was a really big piece for me, was just make sure I'm always asking permission, so I'm not, again, forcing, and giving them the choice to accept or decline. And that was that has been a really big piece for me. And like when I'm working with a guest, is to recognize that there are boundaries, but then also, anytime I'm working with someone, to make sure that they have that choice, that they can decline it, and not to take it personally, if they choose to decline it. So yeah, that transition was relatively smooth, and yeah, I mean, you kind of know the tempo of retreats at the temple, and I was, yeah, I'd say the first 6 months, which in retrospect probably felt like 2 years compressed, where I was facilitating, like that was the really big learning curve, and just, yeah, understanding group dynamics in a container that a lot of stuff opens up, and understanding where my center is, trying to figure out, like, not getting caught up in someone's narrative or someone's story, or, taking on too much. And that, I feel, was probably the biggest challenge. And I feel it's also pretty common for people that are in this work to it's a trapping in a sense, but it's not necessarily negative. It comes from a good place, but it's also not ideal, and it can be very detrimental to the actual facilitator, because this level of care that we provide, whether that's holding space or just being present for someone, is very energetically draining. And there's almost this tendency of like putting someone else's needs above ours. And I saw that with, a handful of other facilitators. And it's a hard pill to swallow, because it's like, no, I want to help, right? But at the same time, like, how good are you to help somebody if you're totally, wasted and don't have the energy level to really be focused and present? When someone is sharing something very, intimate or very painful for them, and you don't have the energy to be focused. So, finding that line, that took a longer period of time to kind of like figure that out. And it was pointed out to me several times. Like, you need to kind of just take some time for yourself. Like, you don't have to be here every second, of every moment during a retreat. So, yeah.
How would you describe that role of facilitation? And also, it's interesting because I did an interview earlier today where the topic was like, what does it take to be a facilitator? Because I think that's something that there's also, again, with the expansion of this work, it's something that's becoming more prevalent. Like, what does that mean to facilitate a ceremony? Who is that person? What is that role? And what does that really entail? And what are skills that you found that make someone good at that job?
First and foremost, I would say humility. Like, understanding that that role is to be of service. It's not to be, this a superstar or, be the go-to person. It's about, for me, being humble, because the opportunity that I'd say the facilitators that worked at the temple, and even at Soltara, it's a very unique role, and if anything, it's a gift to be able to step into that, because one, you get to meet an amazing number of people. I mean, just the broad spectrum of people that come through and the personalities, and to engage with them, in a time and space that they're choosing to actually open, in some very raw ways. It's an incredible gift. So having humility around that, like, I'm fortunate. I am very, very fortunate to be in this role, and having gratitude for that. As far as skill sets go, being like an active listener, like not just listening to someone because they're talking and you're lunch is in 2 hours and I'm really hungry, but like being so present that a torrential rainstorm could be happening, and it doesn't faze you because you're so locked in on that person. Like, you're giving them your undivided attention, which is hard, because there are times where like thoughts are going to come through, like, did I do this? But like, if you can, I found I was at my best when I could quiet that and just be locked in on that person, and just, on a subconscious level, or somehow it was communicated, like, you have all the time in the world. Like, I don't have to be anywhere. Like, whatever you need to share, whatever you feel like sharing, I'll hold that space for you without any judgment, without trying to solve or, figure out, what your problem is. Like, I will just let you be you for this moment in time. And that could last 5 minutes, that could last hours, and this goes back into like that fine line and like recognizing like, okay, there is a time where, if it starts to repeat, the person starts to repeat themselves, or it gets out of that space where it's authentic and more of a show, then, I need to set that boundary and like kind of close that space down. But
can you speak about why that's important?
It's important because, if someone is, let's say, caught up in a narrative or is, they're going into this narrative, and the more that they actually feed it, it actually can be detrimental because they're not working their way out of the narrative or the story that's been created. They're just recycling it and repeating it and reinforcing it. And it's kind of like just running on a treadmill, like you're not going anywhere. And it maybe feels good for that individual because it reaffirms certain false beliefs or a narrative. But at the end of the day, it doesn't really help them to progress. So, kind of just either disengaging, like, or bringing them back to the actual point that they first raised in a reflection, using their own words back to them, actually can help break that. In another sense, if that's how they've gotten attention, right? Again, it's a very common thing that I've seen with guests is they'll act out or they'll retell a certain story or, a trauma, and it doesn't invalidate the trauma that actually happened, but they're not putting the time and energy into healing, what that moment in time, that trauma impacted them and the results of that, but they're focused on this victim mentality. And because they keep looping back into that, that's how they get attention, that's how they get validated, that, in a way to gain sympathy. And that's actually disempowering for people is, to have someone hear you and, have this sense of compassion versus, this kind of almost this societal thing that seems to happen, which is where you hear people who, I think of like, Oprah Winfrey or like Maury Povich, these talk shows where you have someone who's like pouring their heart out and you get a shot of the audience and they're like, oh, like that's so sad. It's this false sense of sympathy, but the person gets attention from that and a sense of validation. And it's actually, it's a disservice to them if I engage with in that manner. And that's not what I want, for them is to be inauthentic. And so if I feel like they're trying to pull on these heartstrings because it reinforces their sense of like, these shitty things happen to me and like how, the world's so cruel. And it's like, okay, you can continue believing that, but does that actually help you move forward in life? Because if you're going to constantly look through that lens that the world owes you something because of these past experiences and you're not doing anything to correct, some of these protection patterns that are keeping you in that victim state, I can't have sympathy for you. And it doesn't mean that I don't care, but I'm not going to be party to that little game that's going on, if that makes sense. And I hope that doesn't sound cold, but yeah, that's part of the reason, or those are the reasons that it's not beneficial as a facilitator to engage with those type of interactions. And, it's interesting because the moment that a facilitator or that I've in that role have chosen to not engage with that, it causes the person to actually shift, because it's what they've done and is familiar with them in the past that's worked so well to gain sympathy, to gain reinforcement of this victim mentality or this belief of, the world is shit and that they're owed, so much because of their past traumas. The moment that I don't engage with that, they need to change tactics, which is really interesting. And in plenty of instances where I've had guests that are trying to pull me into this narrative and I'm not engaging with it, usually there's some anger that comes up right away. But then again, if I just give them the space, like, okay, you're angry. Can we acknowledge that? Yes. Okay, why? What's connected to that anger? Well, it feels like you don't care about me. It's like, okay, do you believe that? No. Okay, let's go a little bit deeper, and again, just kind of like allowing them to start processing. Like, I had one guest that I was doing it in a gentle way, but I was kind of poking holes in her story, and she actually stopped and she's like, it's really fascinating. Like, I'm getting angry at you. And I was like, okay, why is that? And she's like, well, I'm angry because, like, I know you're trying to help me. And I was like, okay. I was like, so what do you want to do? Like, I don't know. I think I need to sit with this. It's like, okay. But yeah, it's, to facilitate, it really does require a lot of not just your own personal self-awareness, which is why I think having, why the temple had 100 ceremonies. It's, you start to understand your own triggers, your own patterns. But you've also seen kind of a good spectrum of what ceremonies can present. And so when you're working with guests, the more self-aware, or I don't want to say necessarily self-aware, the more a person has gone into themselves, the less likelihood there is of them projecting onto the guest their hopes or desires, or being susceptible to being sucked into that guest's hopes and desires or stories or whatever. So you can just be almost like a blank canvas for them to bounce things off of, and you're not engaging on an emotional level into the story, but you're engaging into the emotional spirit that they have. So you have empathy for that pain, for the anger, for the frustration. You can meet them with unconditional love. And that's, it takes time. I remember Matthew telling me when I first got to the temple, it takes about 3 to 4 years to train, a really solid facilitator. And yeah, it took me, I'd say, about 3 to 4 years to feel like I was competent, within that role, just because of so many different guest experiences that came through, and just there were some guests that really triggered me, and I knew like I'm not the right person to facilitate this person, and that's a really big can be a big ego hit, So I remember the first time I actually went to my co-facilitator and was like, you need to work with this person. And it wasn't coming from a place of like, I don't want to deal with this person. It was coming from a place of like, I'm not the right person. As much as I would like to help this person, it's just not, I'm not the right person. They're not going to listen to me, or whatever it is. Like, that's not me. And that was brutal for me to actually have to express to my coworker at the time. Like, so again, knowing you're not the right person for every single person out there, which is why I would say a center that has, or any place, ideally you want at least 2 facilitators, and hopefully it's, a male and a female, just to have a bit of balance between the genders. But
can you speak about that? Because without trying to offend people, I think we live in an interesting time where, in some sense, we don't want to recognize the inherent power or difference or uniqueness that a man and a woman can bring. That they're just. So why do you feel that's important? Like, what would be issues or things? Like, because I think what you said was really important, and I think that's really a sign of humility too, is where we realize, like, hey, like, I think if I engage with this person, it's not going to be the best for that person. Right. Maybe also for you it won't be, but at least try, because I think we owe it to that person. Right. Like, can you try? Because I think maybe you can do a better job than I can. But why? Because in that situation, it could be 2 men or it could be 2 women. Right. Like, what do you think is that importance? But because I completely agree with you. I think there is a real power in having a man and a woman.
I mean, energetically, there's a difference. And everyone's different, and this gets really interesting because I faced this more while I was working at the second center. We're at a very interesting time in the human experience around gender roles. And so, it was the first time that I really, on a high frequency level within retreats, had to be mindful of my pronoun use. So we had guests that were coming in that, preferred to be, use the pronoun they. And some who were very abhorred, using he or she. So that was interesting, and I understand it, and I definitely honored it when they would bring it up. So, let me back up a bit. The importance that I feel with having a male and a female facilitator, and ideally a male and a female curandero, in that space is energetically there's a balance there. I've worked with other males where it's just been this other male and myself facilitating, and I can feel it. I can feel it in the space. It's a little bit more masculine, and I'd like to think that I'm pretty in touch with my feminine side, but at the end of the day, I'm a male, and there's a certain vibration and frequency that is inherent, and from a guest experience standpoint, there definitely are moments where there are some males who are going to be more comfortable and going to feel more safe, or will feel safer in speaking about certain things with a male facilitator. Just as there are females that will feel a lot more comfortable speaking about certain things in their experience with another female facilitator. With that being said, there's also a crossover. There are some things that a male will only want to share with a female facilitator, and a female guest will only feel comfortable sharing with a male facilitator. So having that option, it really comes back into providing, this goes into the container, providing the choice for the guest to choose. Who do they feel comfortable with? Who do they want to engage with? Who do they want to share what they want to share with? And that could be a male in one instance, it could be a female in another. And I feel it's important to provide that for guests, irregardless of how a facilitator or guest, self-identifies gender-wise, but to have that choice. And, they might not choose at all to engage with either facilitator, but, I think it also comes into this thing of a shared experience. There are certain things that being a male and growing up as a male that I can understand, but I can't empathize, and I can't empathize with from a female experience. Like it's just, I won't have that base of knowledge or experiential reference point. So, yeah, that's why I feel it's important to have, a male and a female facilitator within the space. I think it also, and this goes back into, I've never had to experience this, obviously, but based on the horror stories that I've heard where there's been some inappropriate physical contact, typically between a male curandero, it's usually with a female patient or guest, and oftentimes it's because there hasn't been, a female curandera in that space. It's not obviously in every single case, but I feel it also mitigates that potential of impropriety or inappropriate contact happening within the ceremony space. And then also outside of the ceremony space, having a male and a female. I mean, I think you just kind of are going to be more aware and more present with how you engage, or at least how I engage with other guests. So yeah, especially of the opposite sex.
All of the gender studies people just unsubscribe to the podcast.
I hope I didn't offend anybody. I'm
joking with you. I think these things are super important to talk about, and it's a big topic these days, and I think part of that is also, as you were saying, is honoring the traditions we're working in, and certainly for all of the people I've worked with, there are different gender roles, and they're seen as having different powers, and that's even something that I may have questioned before I did this work, but it's something I can't not question it anymore, but I for sure see it from a different angle. Just from a vast amount of experience, the inherent energies that men and women, as you said, carry are different. Now it's not black and white, and every individual is different, and they carry different energies. But even in the work I do with my friend and colleague Marav, it's very apparent these different polarities that we embody. How people react to that is very different. What they take from that is very different, and it's one of the main reasons I chose to work with her too. Was there's this, I think, very beautiful balance to that, and. This is great. Can you think of any other qualities or tools that are really beneficial for a facilitator?
Patience, lots and lots of patience.
I think I had asked Leela that question, what does it take to be a good curandero, and her first answer was patience.
That's if you're not familiar with patience, you will become very familiar with it as a facilitator, because again, I think this goes back to the ego piece. However a process unfolds for any given guest is rarely ever going to coincide with the timetable that you'd like it to be on. And that's great, Again, coming back into, it's really not about the facilitator. I personally believe anyone with their mind and their heart in the right place can step into this role. It's not, it requires dedication, it requires commitment, but, like most things in life, if you want to become good at it, that's what it requires, is that perseverance, that dedication, that willingness to return when it's not fun, and it's not, you kind of rub off that initial illusion, that sheen of what you think it's going to be. it's a lot of selfless work. And where I've seen people get tripped up that are wanting to step into that is oftentimes because they're still stuck in this ego piece. Like it's about me, like, or, you know, they want to have some notoriety or a name to it. And, you know, this I think also ties into the healers that I admire and I respect, that are Shipibo, you know, and it's not about them, it's about the medicine. Like they're the conduit for the medicine and the vehicle for the medicine to work through, and they're highly skilled at what they do, but they definitely don't want to kind of pick up that mantle of like they're amazing and they're the best thing since sliced bread. Like there's humility, you know. There's humility without the self-deprecation. You know, it's that it's confidence in their skill level and who they are as a healer, but they don't take it to this next level of that, you know, fall into that what Western medicine calls the God complex, you know, that surgeons sometimes fall into. So the healers that I respect, you know, when I've tested them, you know, at different points, like asking them about the medicine, like where they see their place in it, and it's like in service to the plants. In service to the plants. I'm a tool or I'm a vehicle for the plants, you know, and that level of humility has always impressed me. And the facilitators that I respect and admire and that I feel I've learned probably the most from is they approach it that way. It's like, I'm here to be of service, you know, and I don't have answers and I don't want to have the answers for anybody. And it's really not about me at the end of the day. And it's nice to get compliments, but it's also kind of uncomfortable and a little bit unwarranted, you know, but, yeah, skill-wise, patience, a good sense of humor, a really good sense of humor, being able to laugh at yourself, being able to laugh at certain situations, will carry you quite far in this work. I remember this one time I was in Maloka 1, and it was a crazy night. Like it was just explosive. Like there was stuff happening all around the space, and I remember walking, and my foot went into a purge bucket, and the first thought that came into my head was like, that's gross. It's just like, but it was so funny. Like I was cracking myself up just because it's like, yeah, you know, that's pretty gnarly. But yeah, I found it to be just hilarious that, you know, in all of this craziness, I step into a purge bucket and, you know, it's the only time that it's happened. But it was like funny for some reason. So yeah. I'd say off the top of my head, those are kind of patience, sense of humor, humility, gratitude, really being a good active listener. Yeah, that's what I'm sure I'll think of more later on.
You mentioned these two words, which I found fascinating because I've often said this, but for me, in that ceremonial space, when there's often two words that when people share those, I have a very deep felt sense that that person is connected to the medicine, and that's gratitude and humility. You mentioned this idea of kind of like an ego inflation, and it's something that I think is becoming maybe more of an issue. I mean, certainly here in the Sacred Valley, you can see it, but just in the world is, I mean, especially with things like social media and even these reward systems, these dopamine spikes of likes and shares, and so I mean, I think to some degree it's only natural that that would also transfer to this world as well. But do you have a sense of where it can be very beneficial or even essential to work within a certain lineage or a certain system that kind of has a check and balance for that, where if the ego does start getting inflated, there's someone there to kind of help to bring you down? Almost as you said, like when you're facilitating someone, it's because if we let that just start to run wild, it starts to gain steam, and it becomes more and more of a problem, rather than if it's cut at the root in the beginning, it's seen and it's recognized, it's much easier to work with.
Well, I mean, I think that there's another component to that, which is not just within the lineage, but like, does the individual have a teacher or teachers, that will act as that check and balance to that process, Again, I'm just speculating based off of some of the stories that I've heard of people that are running, predominantly circles in the, up north. They haven't trained in a lineage. They've maybe had a couple ceremonies, or maybe they've had one or two plant dietas, but, they've never been given permission by, a maestro or a maestra to serve medicine. Or, they take on very early, like they're meant to be a curandero, which again, in fairness, that very well may be the truth. But, the time that's spent studying, and going through the system completely, is a long process. I've met very few Westerners, and this includes my time, at the temple, that have gone through a full apprenticeship. And, that says a lot. I've met one person, who I won't name, who supposedly went through a full apprenticeship. He's quite well known. And I was in a ceremony with him, and he started to sing, but it was not, if he was trained within the Shipibo system, it was not an ikra that like I'd ever heard or was even familiar with. Like, there were no commands as far as the words, right? It was something so different that I was uncomfortable in that space, that this person was working on someone, and this is a Westerner, and I was like, I'm not comfortable in this space. I'm leaving, just because energetically I didn't recognize what he was doing, and yeah, supposedly he trained within the Shipibo system. I've never met his maestro, but I mean, again, for me, at the end of the day, and I hold this true to this very moment in my life, working within the medicine space. At the end of the day, the only thing that I have is my reputation. The only thing I have is my reputation. And all it takes is one step over a line of impropriety, of not being in integrity, and I lose it. And to rebuild that within this space is hard, if not impossible. And there are plenty of healers that, I know I will never sit with because of things I've seen them either do in the ceremony space or things that they've done outside of the ceremony space. Just my trust isn't there. It's not that they're bad people. I just don't want to work with them, and I don't want to sit with them. And in some cases, it's sadness more than anything else. Not even anger. It's more sadness that like this person is so talented, and yet I don't want to associate with them because of things that they have done. And, you know, it can seem kind of counterproductive or counterintuitive to, you know, what often comes up in the medicine space around forgiveness, right? And again, you know, I think there's a difference between when you have power within that space and how you choose to work with it versus a guest who's going through a process around forgiveness. So it's kind of like you should know better kind of thing. So with that being said, yeah, if anyone is wanting to step into medicine work, whether that's as a facilitator, as a host, whether that's as someone who's wanting to start apprenticing and learning how to actually work on people, you know, hold this as a very core part of your work is you are only as good as your reputation. And the moment that gets tarnished, yeah, it could be the end of your time within this space. Maybe it isn't, but, you know, to lose that is, for me, kind of like going back to this death piece, like that would devastate me, you know, if hopefully, I never come to that point, but if that were to ever happen where I cross a boundary that I know is inappropriate, even if no one found out, I think I would have to take myself out of this type of situation or equation of working with medicine, just because, yeah, I wouldn't be living with myself within integrity. So
one of the questions that came up in this interview was, again, as this work begins to expand and spread, you know, as you said with this guy who you didn't feel was qualified, how do you see, I mean, do you see some sort of system or way that there is some sort of qualification where you can go to someone and whether it's a certificate or a training or something where you can say, like, this person is now skilled? Or is it just something where it's also one of these fields where maybe there's not a way of doing that?
I trust its reputation at the end of the day. I do. You know, but this, you know, it also places responsibility on not just the practitioner or the facilitator, but on the people that choose to sit with, you know, certain healers or work with certain facilitators. It's like it behooves them to do their research, right? The guest or the patient to do their research on who are you actually sitting with, who are you opening yourself up to? Because, you know, it's a small community, as you know, you know, and you hear things through the grapevine. And, you know, I usually try and, you know, step away from the gossip or you know, the rumor mill. But when it's been verified by, you know, more than two people that have firsthand experience, you know, I tend to trust that. It's not an infallible system by any means.
Because also, for example, I mean, I often get emails or messages from people saying, like, hey, Jason, do you know of this center?
Right.
And almost always the answer is no.
Yeah.
You know, and I do this work, but there's so many places, like,
Yeah.
I have no idea. And so if I don't know about them, like how is that person also going to really, you know, if they're in
Right.
Ohio or something and this place is in Pucallpa,
Right.
like, they don't know anyone who's been there. It's like a new world. It's
Right.
foreign. Like, maybe there's some testimonials on the website or something, but
Yeah, so that's a great question. On a personal level, I've just kind of gotten to this point where I don't recommend anything anymore. Like, you know, what I will often do is, kind of put it back to the individual, like, okay, so you found this place. Does it feel right for you? And if there's like some wavering, like, I'm not certain, like, I don't know, versus like, yes, that to me, like when I was doing my research, between the temple and some other centers, like after looking through them, and like, it was just a solid yes for the temple, like without question. I was like, yep, this is the place. And I had, I'd done my research, but it wasn't like I'd gone super in depth on, the whole history of the temple and all of the healers, and, but that was how I determined it. And this can seem really flippant, but I want to put the trust in individuals, and this comes back into agency, who am I to recommend any one center? Like, I don't necessarily want to carry that burden. And at the same time, for an individual to give that power over to me, like, again, it's not something I necessarily want either, because I want them to come back and say, well, you're the one who told me to go to this place and it sucked, right? Or I had this horrible experience. Or I had a wonderful experience and I went because of Scott, and then it turns into this kind of, telephone game of they tell someone else because I, referred them or I told them to go to this place. So again, agency needs to come from that individual. If they've done their research and they feel like this place is the right place, who am I to say that it's not for them? Who am I to say that it is? Like, do they trust their own intuition? Do they trust themselves? Have they done the research? Have they looked into it? And we have amazing technology these days. I mean, there are the healers that are highly questionable. I mean, they have a reputation online. It's not too hard to find out who some of these healers are. And then, just, again, testimonials can be helpful. Oftentimes you're only going to see positive testimonials, right? So
Probably always.
yeah, probably always. But, I'd say it's the trickiest part of wanting to come and work with the medicine is finding people that you trust. So one of the things that I've shared with guests that when they've brought up to me like, hey, have you heard of this person? I want to sit, in North America with this group or this, this curandero. And what I will arm them with are just questions. Who's cooking the medicine? Where's the medicine coming from? Where is it being sourced? How many years has this person been actually holding ceremonies, like working on people? Have they trained in a system? Which system? Have they gone through the full apprenticeship? Who is their maestro? Who is their maestra, if they had one? How many diets have they had? Like, what kind of diets? And this is more pertaining to, I'd say, the Shipibo or mestizo traditions, but, there are Colombian and Brazilian traditions that work with the medicine differently. So again, these are usually armed with, these questions are more specific for people who are wanting to sit with someone who's either been trained or is saying that they've been trained by the Shipibo or our Shipibo healers. So, yeah. But, again, like asking questions, all of these questions, they should never raise, in my opinion, from the person who's being asked to answer them, hostility. Like, if the person is legit and they're working with integrity, they should actually be happy that these questions are being asked, because this person is actually, wanting to make sure that this person has gone through, knows what they're doing, and is working with the medicine in a manner that is not just authentic, but with integrity.
It seems like, especially in North America and in the U.S. and Canada, the direction this work is moving is towards this psychedelic assisted therapy,
Yeah.
where people are using synthesized versions of plants or chemicals. It's in a clinical setting. There is like regulation where you need two therapists. One has to be like a registered psychologist or psychotherapist. Do you think there's benefit in that, and do you think there's also potentially something lacking from these more traditional ways of working with plants?
Yes. I actually know a therapist that is within this field, and is doing therapies with ketamine, and it's interesting because he comes down and he works with the medicine, so he's kind of he has a foot in both camps. He sees the benefits of both. I'd say where the psycho-assisted therapies, it's a lower threshold for an entry point for Westerners because it does come with kind of that stamp of Western medical approval, like in a certain sense, that it's clinical, that you can, give a specific dose of whether that's MDMA or ketamine, or, in some cases, I think psilocybin, like they have extracts, but, maybe it's too big of a jump, for someone to make, to go into, whether it's the jungle or to another medicine center, ayahuasca center, to work with this medicine right out of the gate. And that's maybe the first step for them. So I feel it has a place. To answer the second part of your question, is it lacking something from, these indigenous cultures? I feel like there is the potential, absolutely, that it is, because I think you said this once, which I really held on to, and I've actually used a few times with guys, but we were at the
5% commission.
There was this, we were at the temple and we were talking, and you brought up this really beautiful point around, what is an altered state of consciousness? What is that? You drink a cup of coffee, you enter into an altered state of consciousness. It's not extreme in the sense of, going on a psychedelic, but you are changing biochemically, your level of awareness, right? It becomes heightened. We do this on a daily basis, but we don't think anything of it. So what does that actually mean? And when you start to step into psychedelics, where that altered state of consciousness can be quite vast and expansive, it's not uncommon that there's this, a spiritual side can come in, and is that being addressed? How do you address that? Western medicine, the trope goes that it focuses on addressing the symptom, not the root, and traditional medicines, plant medicines, especially within the Shipibo tradition, they tend to go for the root, Iboga, tends to go to the root, and it doesn't really deal with the effects, or the what's the word I'm looking for? The symptoms. So I would say, yeah, I don't know. I've never worked with any therapists, in that type of a setting. So I don't know, how do they address some of these things that come up around spirituality, around this deeper sense of self, I don't know what that process looks like, but yeah, there is, I'd say, a potential risk if that isn't combined into the overall therapy. And I think maybe that's the point I want to drive home, is where this system, with the Shipibo system, it's holistic, it's all encompassing. And my concern with, and I could be totally off base here, but my concern with, the current state of psycho-assisted therapy is it still too laser focused on maybe just one component rather than looking at the totality of the human being and the complexities that entails, So I think that's also the beauty of these indigenous, medicines, whether it's iboga, whether it's psilocybin, not psilocybin, ayahuasca, peyote, huachuma. I mean, there tends to be this approach to looking at the human as a very complex, entity. And there's a physical level, there's an emotional level, there's a mental level, there's a spiritual level. And all of these components need to come back into alignment and into balance. It's not just focusing on one specific aspect. So,
yeah. Well, beautiful, my friend. We're coming up on 3 hours.
Hope I didn't bore your listeners too much.
That's great. Is there anything else you'd like to talk about that we didn't address? Anything that's on your mind that you'd like to share?
Not offhand. Just grateful for you, for having met you at the temple and being able to Actually, this is a funny story. Before
time goes by, if you're trying to count down when
no. I actually met you when I came in for my work exchange.
I remember that.
Yeah,
with Felix, I think.
It was with Mihao.
Mihao. Okay.
Yeah, you. I think you were in the middle or towards the end of doing your tobacco dietas, and you came in a few times, and I was just like, this is a cool dude. So however long ago that was to now, just super honored and blessed to meet you and know you. So
oh, well, likewise, Scott. Yeah, thank you for coming on, and I appreciate your wisdom. I know it's been a good podcast when we hit the 3-hour mark. So
well, hopefully I didn't bore any of your listeners too much or offend them. Anyway.
If maybe you can just talk a minute or two about what you're up to and kind of the work you're doing now, and if anyone's interested in contacting you or working with you, is there a way they can do that?
So I'm currently back in Sacred Valley. I moved here in December of last year, and have decided to kind of put roots down here for the foreseeable future. And I'm working with Felix and Safa over at Body of Prana.
I interviewed them both, so
okay,
if people want to check out those too.
Yeah, please do. These are, going back to what we were talking about, like Westerners who have gone through like a full apprenticeship within the Shipibo system, like, Felix and Safa have definitely done that. And they're one of the few Westerners that I feel comfortable and totally open to sitting with. I trust them with my life. But, they're medicine family. I've known them from the temple, and they've wanted me to come and work with them for quite a while now. And I feel like I just personally wasn't ready to make that leap. And at the end of last year, I was just like, I'm ready to make that commitment. And if you're interested in the work that we do, it's very different. Typically, we work more with, I'd say, experienced medicine drinkers. That doesn't necessarily mean that we exclude first-time drinkers, but there's a bit of a difference, sitting with Shipibo curanderos and sitting with a Westerner who's been trained within that system. And I get the sense and general feeling that someone who's kind of sat with Shipibo healers and has reached a certain point within their medicine work, they can actually get quite a bit, not quite get quite a bit more. That sounds comparative, but they recognize that there is a benefit to having a Western curandero or curandera singing to them and actually helping them in that process as they go a little bit deeper into the work. With that being said, we all still, go back to our teachers and diet with them. So still wanting to honor and carry on that tradition. But as far as contacts, you can contact me through that website. I really am not on social media. I'm on Facebook, but I rarely check it. But if you throw out a friend request and say I heard you on Jason's podcast, I'd be more than happy to friend you, and then we can, maybe go from there as far as personal contact information. But if you are interested or have questions around medicine work, please feel free to reach out either through the Body of Prana website or find me on Facebook. So, yeah.
Great. And you guys offer specific dates for workshops, or people can kind of come at will?
No, we have specific dates. So we do plant dietas as well as retreats. And those dates, I believe most of this year is already filled up, but beginning of next year or into 2022, I think we're starting to open up dates. So those will be posted on the website.
2022, man, time's going by.
Yeah, it's flying by. So,
yeah. Well, thank you, Scott. It's been a pleasure, my friend.
Thank you.
I think you have a lot of wisdom to share, and I really appreciate it. And I'm really glad our paths cross. And it's always beautiful for me to sit down and to actually learn more about people. Because even though sometimes like we're friends and acquaintances, there's these huge chunks of people's lives I don't know. So it's I find it's always something very endearing, and I learn a lot, and it always makes me respect people a lot more. So thank you, brother. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank
I
you.
hope some people reach out. I know you guys do amazing work. I've to give a little bit of a plug, I've known now quite a few people who've worked with Shipibo, and then they've come to work with Body of Prana, Felix, Saf, and yourself, and they've been incredibly happy. And as you said, they feel like they're actually gaining something that something different, just a natural evolution that I think all of these systems offer. It's kind of expanding our horizons and working with different people, because they both offer different things too in their work and approach. So, and that's great. You're sold out. I'm super happy to hear that. So, yeah.
Well, we try and keep a pretty balanced. We're not a retreat center in that larger scale sense. We try and keep things intimate. So we max out at 7 people for retreats and no more than 5 people for diets. So it's a very small container and very intimate. So kind of feel that's where I want to be working more.
Yeah.
So.
Beautiful, brother. Thank you
Thank
so
you
much.
very much,
It's
Jason.
been a pleasure, my friend. Yeah.
Thank you.
All right, everybody, that's it. I hope you enjoyed this episode with my friend Scott. I really enjoyed sitting down and talking to him. For me, it's always fascinating, even though most of these people I'm friends with, just sitting down in this long format conversation and getting to learn a little bit more about them. And I think he shared a lot of wisdom, a lot of knowledge. So I hope you all really enjoyed that. If you are able to support this podcast, if you feel like you're getting something from it, that's a really big help to me to be able to continue to make these. Patreon is a really good option. It's a subscription service for as little as $1 a month. You can subscribe. There's different tiers you can sign up for, and it gives you back some really nice things. And it's very much, in a way, working with this Andean concept of Aini, or reciprocity. With Patreon, with the subscription and the different tiers, you get things back like early access to shows, bonus material, Q&As, and that's a really big help, and it's a really big help to support this show. To all of the patrons, to all the people who have done that, thank you very much. I really appreciate all of the support. There's also the option of direct donating via PayPal. I'll put a link to both of those in the show notes. And if you're not able to do that, simply going on the YouTube page, subscribing to the show, turning on the notification bell, liking the video, that's a really big help with the algorithms and getting this show out to a bigger and broader audience. And with the audio version going on Apple Podcasts, also subscribing to the show and leaving a starred rating and a short review, that's a very big help. So I think that's it. The next episode's coming up. I believe my friend Adam is coming on, who's an anthropologist. He also has worked in the jungle for a long time, working with plant medicines, so I'll be speaking with him. And I have a few other guests lined up, but I'm not sure the exact order yet, so I'll wait before I say that. But as always, there'll be some really great people coming on. So thank you all for tuning in. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Thank you all for the support, and I will see you all on the next episode.
So